Welcome to Super Context, a podcast autopsy of media.
How we consume it and how it informs our everyday culture.
I'm Christian Sager, a writer and a designer.
And I'm Charlie Bennett, a librarian and a radio raconteur.
Each episode is us trying to understand the entertainment world that we all live in.
Just a little bit better.
Today's episode is about From Hell. This graphic novel by Alan Moore and Eddie Campbell came out between 1989 and 1998, 100 years after the Jack the Ripper murders it's based on. We look at the meticulous research they put into this to try to understand how this story manages to be about true crime while indulging in deep themes regarding English identity, psychogeography, and the nature of time.
You can find the show page at patreon.com/supercontext, where you can leave us a comment or write us an email at supercontextpodcast@gmail.com. When did you first hear about From Hell? And were you able to read it then?
Charlie, I woke up in the middle of the night the other night screaming.
Is this news? Why?
I
why
rolled
are you bringing
over.
It up now?
I rolled over, and I was half asleep, and I opened my eyes, and I could have sworn I saw William Gull's face emerge from the shadows next to my bed, right toward my face, and I yelled out loud in the room, in the real world. I yelled, and woke up my wife and all our animals.
How often do you have nightmares that bring you out that violently and wake other people up?
Very rarely. I think that's the first time in years.
The only time I've had this kind of nightmare, and I've had it, I had it a lot, was when I was living in Boston, actually. A friend of mine who was living in Atlanta killed himself, and I dreamed him a lot in various ways.
And did you wake up yelling, or did you wake yourself up?
I woke myself up a couple times, not with like a yell, but with a sort of some kind of communicative sort of wake up. Like there were a couple times when I was delighted to see him. I remember one dream that was totally oh, look at that, you fooled everybody. And I was talking to him and woke myself up. And then also he was a ghost. He was a sort of vengeful ghost and woke me up, or I woke myself up through that dream. It's a freaky, freaky fucking thing when that happens.
Yeah, I have hypnagogic jerks pretty regularly. You know what those are?
I do.
Yeah, where you feel
the
like
audience
you're
might not, though.
Yeah, so it's that thing where you feel like you're falling in a dream and then you wake up right when you're about to hit the ground or something like that.
And the actual movement wakes you in a way.
Yeah, that happens fairly regularly, but nothing like this. And I have been reading that during the coronavirus quarantine that we're in right now, apparently people are having nightmares more regularly. And so when it happened, I was like, well, maybe I guess I could attribute it to the overall anxiety and stress of that going on. And I have been power reading through From Hell.
You were in the pre-production process for this episode, right? I mean, there's a reason that it was William Gull's face. It wasn't just the return of the repressed for you.
Right. Yeah, no, I've been reading this at a steady clip for about a week now. And, it really scared the shit out of me. I'd never thought of him before as a supernatural, scary villain in the way of I don't know, Leatherface or Hannibal Lecter or something like that until this reading. I think this is my third full read through of this book.
Had you done the work on Eddie Campbell's talking about Hannibal Lecter? Had you been sort of prepped to read him now as Gull, read Gull now as Lecter?
I was in that process. Yeah. So it was interesting because I woke up and I was shocked, and I woke everybody up in the middle of the night. And then, the next morning I was like, okay, obviously it's because my subconscious is trying to put these pieces together.
You're processing a lot of shit.
Yeah. But it reminds me that it wasn't that long ago that I was the kind of young gentleman who went on Jack the Ripper tours in London.
You went on a Jack Ripper tour?
Oh, yeah.
Was Kyle Kinane there?
No, but that Kyle Kinane bit has a particular piece of resonance for me because that's how I felt when I did it. This was
Can
probably...
you explain that punchline? I mean, we don't have to do the setup. Can
There's
you just
a Kyle
explain
Kinane,
what the joke is?
Yeah, he has a joke on one of his recent records about how he went to London and he did one of the Jack the Ripper tours, and that he felt kind of gross about how commercial the whole thing was. And then the punchline of the bit is that gets to the very end and the tour guide says, and Jack the Ripper killed as many as 5 victims. And Kyle Kinane's like, 5? He's like, we get that many being killed every day in America. What's the big deal?
Yeah, our serial killers are productive.
So, yeah, so I did that in 2000, I want to say, is when I was in London for that particular trip. And it was very similar. I'm sure our European and British listeners will have more information on this than I do, but at the time, this is going on 20 years ago now, Whitechapel was pretty commercialized. So when we were walking around, it was like, oh, there's a Starbucks. And like, it was very touristy and nice. It's nothing like it's depicted in here. And there's some talk about that in the research, and there's some talk about that from more in the appendices to From Hell, but that the area has become, I guess, gentrified. And so you've got these hordes of people walking through this neighborhood every night. I'd say my tour was like 20 people, and then there were like 3 or 4 other tours concurrently going on around us. So there's just constantly these groups of tourists walking around, going to the sites of each murder. And then I think mine ended at the 10 Bells. I was fascinated with the Jack the Ripper stuff after I read this the first time. I went to London with my then girlfriend. We went on the Jack the Ripper tour. While I was there, I got the Stephen Knight book, The Final Solution.
This very book the book inspired From Hell.
Yeah. And then here's what I did. I went home to America and I visited my grandmother. My grandfather was a Freemason, and he was pretty high up within the New England Freemasonry community. And he was also a Shriner. And I was fascinated by that from reading this book, but also The Final Solution. The Final Solution is like way more into the Masonic conspiracy theory stuff.
Yeah. Yeah.
And I was like, hey, Grammy, you should read this book. So my copy of The Final Solution I left with my grandmother, and I don't know if she ever read it or not.
I have a memory that the more I am unable to find evidence of it online, the less I trust it. But I remember very clearly Leonard Nimoy doing a parody of his like paranormal mysteries show. You remember he was the host on he was a host in the way that Jonathan Frakes is a host of that show that he does now. Okay.
I get what you're saying. Frakes hasn't done that show for 25 years.
Well, no, he's doing it right now because that's the only thing I see on the internet is that clip of him doing that.
That is 25-year-old footage that is now becoming a meme. Jonathan Frakes doesn't look anything like that now.
Well, here's the thing. I don't have any way to describe to you what I'm trying to say. I was hoping that you would be like, yes.
I don't know what you're talking about.
A show that I have connected to many times because of my previous work and stuff to blow your mind. Let me see if I can find it on the internet now. Leonard Nimoy Paranormal Show. In Search Of. Okay. Leonard Nimoy hosted a show called In Search Of, which was investigations into the controversial and paranormal. For instance, UFOs, Bigfoot, Loch Ness Monster.
And Jack the Ripper.
And that's the thing. It was supposed to be Rod Serling. And Leonard Nimoy was tapped because Serling died because cigarettes.
Yeah.
So Leonard Nimoy was doing a parody of a show that I was unaware of because I was young when I saw this thing. I think it was a Saturday Night Live filmed sketch. And Leonard Nimoy did a story about how Jack the Ripper was actually Jackass the Ripper, a donkey that killed all these people. It was very much a land shark style absurdity, but Nimoy did it like hardcore. Like he performed the fuck out of it, right? Mm-hmm. And by the end, he had his Spock ears on to really like slam home how ridiculous this was while still playing it completely straight. And he leaned back in his room, and a voice that was a donkey voice went, Leonard. And, well, my throat did not want to even try to do a donkey neigh at all. But a donkey voice said Leonard, off screen. And he kind of leaned back and said, we never know what will happen, blah, 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 blah.
So we have two very different experiences with the Jack the Ripper mythology.
No, we didn't. Because, listen, that scared me for a long time.
My God, you were such an impressionable young kid.
I was young enough that the non-absurd performance by Leonard Nimoy got under my skin. And so it didn't matter. I didn't like dream of a donkey.
Yeah.
But the creepiness of this idea of the Ripper, Jack the Ripper, got into me.
What that meant?
I didn't. It was, and also here's the thing. I haven't been able to find that ever.
Yeah. So
like, it's starting to feel like I made it up. Yeah. And so Jack the Ripper was in some way a symbol for a little while and then just disappeared because as a young man in America, I started learning about serial killers and what they could actually get up to. Mm-hmm. And Jack the Ripper was just sort of he was a cartoon. He was just like a silly idea. He was a character in that time travel movie.
Time After Time.
Yeah. And so it just became a different, I don't even know how to describe it. I'm kind of lost now in my memory and realizing just how affecting this memory that might not exist has been for me.
Well, I think there's a way to tie this together, right? So both of our experiences, no matter how disparate they are from each other, show what the legacy of Jack the Ripper has become internationally, right? We're not even English citizens. And we have this attachment to the idea of the mythology of Jack the Ripper. And when we were growing up, it was the height of what Moore and the folks in here refer to as Ripperology. And so we were immersed in that point where everybody was trying to figure out who it was. There were a billion different theories. It was really on the mind of people in pop culture. I think because it was the centennial of the first murder. And so there was just a lot of it in the air. And this book is designed to capture that and sort of flip that commercialized pop culture version of Jack the Ripper on its head.
Yeah, by someone who lived close enough to where Jack the Ripper, originated, where it all happened, to think of it more as the Whitechapel killings, as opposed to Jack the Ripper, the killer. I remember when the Stephen King story Spring Heel Jack made its way to me, I think in the Night Shift collection. All I could think is, Jack. So this is Jack the Ripper, because it was so detached from place. It was so detached from history. Jack the Ripper was just an idea that could move from moment to moment.
Yeah.
But this is not, this work is almost like the erasing of that detachment, like the reassociating of Jack the Ripper with the place it was.
Well, I mean, I think I'll just come right out and say this is one of my favorite books of all time. It is my favorite Alan Moore work. It is easily in my top 5 books of all time. And I think one of the things that I love about it so much is that it both fictionalizes and demystifies the murders in a way that I don't think any of the other Jack the Ripper pop culture stuff does, right? Like Time After Time, or what was the Michael Caine movie? Like that stuff. The From Hell movie. Oof. Have you seen that?
Only stills.
Oh boy. Yeah. So this actually like works to demystify and give you some context as to what life was like for the victims, what the disparity was like between classes at the time, what the actual setting was like, and how it contributed to we're going to talk a lot about psychogeography today. But at the same time, Moore and Campbell completely acknowledge this is totally fictional. Neither of them actually think that William Gull was Jack the Ripper. This is just them running with one of the theories and taking it as far as they could in this format.
Yeah. I have learned, as we've done Super Context, and we've done 3 Alan Moore media artifacts up till now. I think it was Neonomicon, Miracle Man, and Providence. Mm-hmm. I have learned that not only do I have a specific preference for what kind of Alan Moore work I like, but it is also kind of my pinnacle enjoyment when it comes to maybe postmodern literature. I adore stories that are threaded through crazy reinterpretations of historical events. Mm-hmm. Not period pieces, not historical recreations, not alternate histories, but stuff that takes that kind of conspiracy theory, that sort of Umberto Eco, Foucault's pendulum style, like deep dive, and plays with it and makes a story out of it that then can kind of hold on to all kinds of ideas, all kinds of things out in the world.
Yeah, I agree. It is a particular trope that grabs me pretty hard. I mean, I would be dishonest if I didn't admit that my graphic novel, The Cabinet, was heavily inspired by From Hell.
Yeah, that's the kind of book. It's like the play of it, the kind of literary game. You know, that's why I like Pale Fire. Mm-hmm. You know, all of a sudden now I can't think of anything I've ever enjoyed in my life. But the literary puzzle, Gravity's Rainbow, although Gravity's Rainbow doesn't operate like this. Mm-hmm. Gravity's Rainbow is more of a fugue, right? Of here's Baghdad. All these things. Yes, Pride of Baghdad is like that. But the idea, I think I enjoy the idea of research as part of the fictional, the fiction writing process. That I'm delighted by the idea of someone having a, It's Always Sunny in Philadelphia style corkboard with yarn and, over. And the reason I have
one of those right behind me right now.
I do, yeah. And the reason I say It's Always Sunny in Philadelphia style is because it's a very minimal mystery in that show that creates this crazy Charlie Day experience. And the idea of being able to find something that is so insignificant historically or sort of so fictional, so untrue, and then play with it and expand it into a inassailable edifice of narrative. It just makes me like excited to think about it and the process. And I feel like this is the moment also where I should tell everyone that coronavirus is affecting my performance on the podcast today. There's a lot of background noise in my house right now. And so you might wonder, why is Charlie sounding so drunk?
I like to think that instead of it being a gaggle of children that are trapped in your home during a pandemic, that it is the ghosts of the victims of Jack the Ripper that are manifesting in the background on our podcast.
Yeah, but there were only 5 victims of Jack the Ripper.
You've got more than 5?
Well, I've got the kids, and then I've got other presences
other spirits in here. That's a good point for us to segue into what this is about. So maybe you don't know about this book. It's called From Hell, and it is a graphic novel by Alan Moore and Eddie Campbell. It was originally published between 1989 and 1998. They spent almost 10 years on this.
So I want to ask you about that. I mean, it is now published as a graphic novel.
Yeah.
But it wasn't, right? It was not. Right. It was a serial. And it was a serial that had huge stretches. It was like a a relative who would come back from their travels every once in a while and drop their journal on you and then go away again.
Yeah. I am not old enough to have been following it when it was serialized. And also, even if I was, Taboo magazine that it was printed in is kind of obscure and I don't think showed up in the comic shops that I was going to. And honestly, and I'll talk about this later when we get to talking about the magazine's publishing history, it's like a white whale for me. Like if I ever find copies of Taboo in a comic book store or like at a convention, I will buy them because they're just amazing. It's a stunning collection of work, and it is where From Hell first appeared. I checked last night because I was like, oh, maybe I can order them on eBay, and each issue is like somewhere between $36 and $60 a pop now.
It's funny. I feel like I remember people mentioning From Hell in process, because I was hanging out with the folks who would really be into this in the early 90s. And I think that there must have been some folks who had found a copy of Taboo somewhere or, had already planned on subscribing to whatever came out of this particular group of people in England. And so they were on top of it. But From Hell was like, who knows when it's going to end? Who knows what it is? Like, and I think that this might have been one of the places where my sort of, I want to read it when it's all completed kind of, general sentiment might have screwed me out of a very interesting experience that I could have had.
Well, one of the things that's fascinating, we'll get into this, is that my understanding is when it was published in Taboo originally, there was no point where it said, this is a story about the Jack the Ripper killings. And so the first, I'd say 4 chapters of this, which would have appeared in separate issues, don't seem connected to that in any way. There's no obvious connection. And it's printed in a horror magazine. So if you're reading it and you clearly knew who Alan Moore was, if you were reading Taboo magazine, you were probably like, what is this? What am I reading? And it was only probably 5 years into the project that it started to become obvious.
Yeah. And this is Alan Moore post-Watchmen, right?
It is,
he has the cachet to do this. He is enough of a known quantity, enough of a brand, enough of a controversy to be able to kind of play off his name.
I wouldn't put it that way. He was a name and he was a big deal at that point, but he had done stuff like this before then too. V for Vendetta was published in a very similar way, but in just a different magazine, serialized over time. Do
you think that V for Vendetta was as obscure though about its plot leading up? I mean,
that's a good question.
It's been a while since I read it.
Yeah.
So that's really what I'm thinking about, is that if you get the first chapter and it's 2 guys talking about British history on a beach.
Yeah, right.
It's like, well, it's Alan Moore, so I'll find out.
Yes, I think for readers,
guys?
But sorry, let me clarify. I think that might be why readers were willing to put up with it. The publishing entity were people that Moore was friends with.
Gotcha,
they would have put this out
I was
anyways.
only thinking of readers. Yeah.
Yeah.
I was thinking of readers and the sort of, okay, I'll trust this person, even though this does not seem like the kind of thing that I would normally get into.
Well, let's be honest. There are also many comic book readers who I imagine bailed on this right away. And especially, I can't remember which chapter it is, but the Psychogeography chapter. Yeah. The one that's just like
the
2
lecture.
Guys in a carriage riding around London and talking about magic for 50 pages, They probably would have jumped ship.
Yeah, speaking of people just talking, so if anyone's made it to this point in the podcast and is still thinking that we are going to break into some kind of detailed breakdown of all of the Easter eggs and bits and pieces of From Hell, that is not going to happen.
No,
we are not doing a content analysis or a historical compare and contrast.
Yeah, and Moore himself does most of the work in that respect in the collected version. The appendices for this is like 60 pages long. That was one of the things that first really impressed me with it when I read it. And I have not read this, but there is like a From Hell companion book that's been published, and I believe it includes more notes, sketches, and I think the complete script, or at least portions of the script.
Cool. So what we're going to talk about in this podcast episode is how From Hell came to be, how it was made, how it was distributed, and how people have responded to it in the larger sense, in the super context, as opposed to here's how Alan Moore, created this particular page with Eddie Campbell.
You know what I just realized is I didn't insert like a short little summary bio of who Alan Moore is into our notes here. I guess I just assumed that all super context listeners would know.
And here's your chance to do it in Alan Moore's voice.
The birth call. No, I'm not going to do that. Alan Moore is a writer and I guess performing artist. He's primarily known for graphic novels and comics, although he has published 2 novels now at this point and done a bunch of performance art pieces, etc. I think he's written screenplays as well. He's mostly known for Watchmen, V for Vendetta, this, Swamp Thing, and Batman the Killing Joke. That's the other big thing that people associate him with. And League of Extraordinary Gentlemen. I could probably go on and on and on, but he's well known. A lot of his work has been adapted. If you're an Alan
Moore fan, you feel more and more like the stuff that he's done is important and famous, right?
Probably,
like
yeah.
You get into the place where you're like, and of course his Tom Strong work is so powerful.
Yeah, I've never read Tom Strong.
I know that was one that I wanted to pull out because you said you'd never read it.
I need to get to Tom Strong eventually, but I haven't done it yet. But yeah, so he was a big deal, was a big deal, is a big deal. And this project came about in the autumn of 1988. According to him, he was thinking about that he wanted to write something long and serious about murder. And he wasn't even thinking about Jack the Ripper and the Whitechapel killings. He said that was too played out and too obvious. But then the 100th anniversary came around, and that got him interested in the Stephen Knight book, Jack the Ripper, The Final Solution, which I referenced earlier. Let's briefly summarize this book.
So Stephen Knight had the idea. He presented a theory, which I guess is a conspiracy theory, that the 5 women who were murdered in 1888 by a person unknown or persons unknown that we now call Jack the Ripper were actually killed as part of a cover-up of a secret marriage between Prince Albert Victor, who was second in line for the throne, and a working class girl. So the somewhat chaotic and uncontrolled Prince Albert went out, got someone pregnant, married them, and in order to keep that from destroying the reputation of the crown, from dismantling the sense of what royalty was, Sir William Gull, Queen Victoria's private doctor, was sent out to murder all of the women who were trying to blackmail the British royalty into paying them off so they wouldn't tell about how Prince Albert married someone and has a baby with them.
Yeah, and there's a strong thread of Freemason conspiracy theory through there that William Gull, as a Freemason, was contracted to do this, and Moore takes that and really pulls it out to like the nth degree in a kind of occult fashion.
And in doing so also declares that it's complete bullshit, right?
Yeah. He does not believe this. He doesn't believe most, if any, of the theories about who Jack the Ripper was. In fact, there is an appendices comic to From Hell that was published after the series was finished that is called, The Flight of the Gullcatchers, or The Dance of the Gullcatchers. And
it's very distinctly about people who are trying to track down something about Jack the Ripper.
Yeah.
Trying to make something of these stories.
Yeah. Tim Callahan, who we've referenced on the show before and is somebody I know in real life, he wrote about From Hell on Tor.com. And he said, Stephen Knight's book has been discredited by most sources, but that only matters if you're looking for From Hell to actually reveal truths about Jack the Ripper. That's not what the story's about. He says Jack the Ripper is a character in this in the same way that Watchmen is about Rorschach. You know, you're not trying to actually figure out something that happened in real life by reading Watchmen.
And the true reveal or catharsis of the book is not about discovering that it's true. This is how it happened.
Yeah. And Tim refers to this as historical fiction that's heavily researched rather than genre fiction that is heavily based on nostalgia. So this book, Moore basically got to this point where he was reading about these murders and he read Stephen Knight's book and he decided, you know, I think I should approach this. I should try to do this as a comic. And Stephen Bissette, who was the artist on Swamp Thing, had just started the idea of publishing a creator-owned horror anthology comic that was called Taboo. And he said, hey, Moore, pitch something to us. And he was like, I think I want to do this Jack the Ripper story. And Eddie Campbell, the artist, had already submitted a short that was going to appear in the first issue of Taboo. And so Bissette said, I think you and Eddie Campbell should work together on this. And that's how they got connected. It
just feels so, it's like magical, you know, the idea that this is how it all came together.
Have you ever read any Eddie Campbell comics other than this?
No, this is the only one. And I don't mean like, oh, it's magical that Alan Moore and Eddie Campbell came together, but just the idea of there being this kind of, this zine, right? This anthology comic. Thinking about it now, it's like, how could that ever get off the ground now?
Yeah, believe me, that's something I think about a lot lately.
Yeah. And to draw together these two really powerful creators to make something that has lasted as long as it has. Yeah. And, you know, is some people's favorite book, et cetera, et cetera. It just seems like, oh, what a far off time. What a sweet, innocent time of artistic creation that must have been.
This was a period that was kind of a height of, I don't want to call them underground comics, but like alternative comics being distributed through the direct market and being successful. This was when, you know, Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles was taking off, or Cerebus, or Love and Rockets, right? Like stuff like that, black and white alt comics were able to reach enough people and generate enough income that the creators could feasibly eat a meal off of it. You know, right. I don't know the history of Taboo's like accounting, so I'm not sure if that was the case here or not. But we'll talk a little bit more about that because they burned through some money pretty quickly too.
Yeah. So let's talk a little bit about what Moore's pitch must have been like, because he's talked about From Hell enough that you can kind of get a sense of what he was thinking at the time when he pitched it to Bissette. Moore says, once I read the florid and fabulous allegations in Knight's book, I thought this has got the bones of something. And then I read everything on the subject I could find, starting to put it all together into this huge edifice. I was not at all interested in who Jack the Ripper was. That's Hardy Boys stuff. It was the behavior of the culture that fascinates me and still does. So he had the idea for, I'd like to do a story. I'm not quite sure what it is, but I think I want it to be about a murder, you know, to play with that kind of simple but really powerful convention. He gets attached to the Jack the Ripper murders, which he didn't expect because of this crazy-ass book. And then he starts to research not only Jack the Ripper, but that time period, and it starts to expand. And now he's researching royalty and architects. He says the William Gull figure is the culprit I came upon because he was the most interesting, because he connected to a much bigger world than any of the others, so I could use him to explore all these kinds of mythical aspects of the Jack the Ripper story. And in that quote, I feel like there's almost him saying, I got excited because of the Knight book, and I looked maybe for some other possibility, like maybe something else that would be a good Jack the Ripper conspiracy theory to attach to, but he stayed with Gull because of that royal connection.
This is definitely one of the juiciest ones. He went on to say that as he was doing the research, he was unnerved and amazed because he kept finding, quote, confirming evidence that could support a theory. Those are in quotes because he doesn't believe either of those to be true. And he says, I knew it wasn't a theory. I knew it was fictional. but I didn't want to put a toe into the inviting pool of what the truth might be, because truth with a capital T is a well-documented pathological liar.
So he took the sort of statement of it was a cover-up of a blackmail allegation, and William Gold did it, and then started making up his own version of that, expanding on it, and then he kept finding things that made it clear that what he was making up was true.
Yeah, and then he starts talking here in the interview about the other Ripper pop culture, and he says most of those treatments, they verge on the pornographic, and there are so many cliches that are used, and most of them are there to dress up the murders and to make it exciting. And then he says this: I can't be the only person who thinks doing that is completely inappropriate when you're talking about the murder of a woman in a miserable back street of Whitechapel. I think that right there is a thesis statement for this book. Again, the demystification, right? It wasn't sexy. It wasn't cool. It wasn't gothic. It was brutal and sad.
Yeah. And he avoided turning it into some kind of redemption or transcendent narrative for the killer.
Yeah.
Making it about a sacrifice that was required in any way, or brought about something good. And he described the murders like the first 4 were quick killings, dirty and in alleys and whatnot. But the final one, the final killing, Marie Kelly, is the emblematic Ripper murder, he says, the one everyone remembers. To get it right, I knew I was going to have to go into that room in Miller's Court with the reader and stay there as long as the Ripper did. He was there for a couple hours, and this is like taking apart a corpse. And I was going to have to try to reconstruct those couple hours in painful detail. It wasn't something I was looking forward to, but I felt that in order to be respectful to the women and the circumstance that I was fictionalizing, I had to show it exactly as it was. This is really interesting to me, Chris, because I think that the end result, he can say, this is what I was attempting to do. And I feel like it's easily something that people can say, this is exploitative and gross and sensationalistic.
Yeah, so I was actually just about to go there, because I think that what he's talking about here with From Hell and this versus the other Jack the Ripper stories is what you and I would think of now about true crime podcasts, right? That there's, maybe it's just me, there are true crime podcasts, I believe, that are exploitative and that are picking up on these sensational, horrible crimes and not really doing a lot of deep research or work with them or revealing a whole lot about human nature through these stories, but just regurgitating awful facts to us, kind of in a gossipy way. And boy, are they successful. And then you get the rare few true crime shows or books, whatever, that really take the time to look at the context in which these crimes were committed within and what the crimes say about the culture that they occurred in.
Yeah, there's, gosh, it's so long ago now, but Patton Oswalt's bit about falling in love with his wife, his first wife.
I was just going to say his wife's book about the Golden State serial killer, I think, is one of the rare ones that attempts this.
And yet, his sort of joke version of how they met was, who's your favorite serial killer? And, oh, yeah, did you know? Well, actually, no, he didn't cut off the hands of the dead. He actually just took the fingers or something. Oh, I'm in love. Like this kind of, there's no difference, it seems, between pieces of the fascination with serial killing. And yet they have these two very different intents and two very different outcomes. Your intent can be, ooh, I want to be all charged up because isn't it amazing? This guy killed these people. Or as Moore said, it needed to be exactly as it was so that, quote, so that any armchair murderers in the audience would be made aware of exactly what it was like spending 2 hours in an overheated, stifling little East End flat cutting up a woman, and to do it in a way which was not glamorous or at all exciting. And yet, I'm sure there's somebody who can take from that sequence that kind of sensationalistic, exploitative enjoyment.
I think there's two somebodies, and they're the Hughes brothers.
Yeah, you think so? You think that was...
that was a cheap joke on my part. But
well, the thing is, I didn't see the movie, so I can't join you in the joke.
The movie does not attempt to address this stuff at all, and it is fascinating how it spends a lot of its time erasing all of these aspects from the graphic novel so that it can just tell the juicy, gossipy story of William Gull being the murderer.
And make kind of a fantastical character out of Johnny Depp.
Oh, God,
to be
yeah. There's so much time spent with Johnny.
The psychic Sherlock Holmes, right?
Yeah, he spends a lot of time in the bathtub doing opium and putting absinthe through sugar cubes. Yeah.
Yeah. So Moore kind of sums it up as saying, I wanted to make it the scene of this final drawn-out murder. I wanted to make it into the kind of apocalyptic scene that I felt it was, to make it a scene of the cultural importance I felt it was. And it's sort of a change of era, right?
Yeah.
That no one knows about because it's only after it's processed by the media and people begin to respond to it. But Moore imagines this to be a kind of the beginning of the 20th century.
Well, it's also a kind of fascinating statement about human communication and the failures of institutions too, right? Because, yeah, it was, at the time he was writing it 100 years prior, but the ways in which the gossip spread around, both from word of mouth, through newspapers, even through the constabulary, there was just so much confusion about who or what was going on. And I find it really relevant to what we're experiencing right now, right? Like
yeah.
Jack the Ripper seems minor compared to the coronavirus pandemic. But when you watch the same way things are playing out currently, there's no way that you can have any contextual understanding of it. He needed a century's distance.
Yeah. And he is thinking about the time before this and the time after it, and he can say, I can clearly make an argument that the Whitechapel killings are a turning point, that stuff before it and stuff after it are so clearly different and seem connected to this moment. It's kind of like someone could try to say, well, the Kennedy assassination is the beginning of the postmodern era, right? They could make the case because of like grand narratives and all that, but there would probably be an argument against it because, well, there's not a distinct difference in the 5 years before and the 5 years after. There's not a sense that this is the first time this ever happened because there have been assassinations before, et cetera, et cetera. But with the Jack the Ripper killings, there does appear to be sort of this node of never before had it been so obvious and named as it was in this moment.
Yeah, it strikes me that the project that Moore was doing here is similar to what Tarantino was attempting with Once Upon a Time in Hollywood. That he was trying to use the Sharon Tate murder as a similar nodal point for defining a before and after in culture.
Yeah, and clearly with a very different sort of entertainment purpose. Tarantino's liberties that he takes with that historical event are not changing the way it happened, but instead changing the very I'm trying to avoid spoilers, changing the lead up and the after effects of the Tate murderers makes his statement, as opposed to Alan Moore trying to make his statement by going into details and making them so specific that you cannot romanticize them. Yeah.
So then he gets into this term called psychogeography that we're going to spend a lot of time with this episode. This is his definition of it. He says it's the understanding that in our experience of any place, it's our associations, our dreams, the imaginings, the history of the place. All of that is the information that is relevant to the place, which is what we experience when we talk about the place.
Can you say those in your own words? Can you re-say that as you would tell someone?
I'll try. This is a tough one for me. My experience with this terminology comes from a Will Self book that's called Psychogeography.
Okay.
And it's a nonfiction book, and the idea is that Will Self did these walking tours of places. He wanted to see if he could. It started off because he wanted to see if he could walk from his home in London to the airport. And because it turns out that the way that London is designed, there's physically no like sidewalks that actually connect to the airport in such a way. And so he got the idea that like by doing these walks, he was going to have a better cultural understanding of the city that he lived in, right, as like a living entity, and how it affected the psychology of individuals and of the entire community.
Nice. I read this as a kind of as a rejection of the ahistorical impulse, right? A kind of American ahistorical impulse, you know, knock down a building and put a parking lot there because it's necessary in this moment.
Yeah, which comes up again later on in terms of this book. Yeah. Moore says that the first time he ever heard the term psychogeography was when he was first researching this book. He said he was sent a copy of Lud Heat by Ian Sinclair. And he said this is one of Ian's super dense poems that are on the verge of turning into prose. And he was dealing with his time spent maintaining lawns and gardens of churches in East London when he worked for the council. And a lot of those were Nicholas Hawksmoor churches. He started to notice some alignments between these churches that were suggestive, and all of this shows up in this book, Lud Heat. He said, Moore says, I was fascinated because this seemed to me to be a new way of engaging with place. Place has always been immensely important in my work, even from the earliest days of my career.
And Alan Moore is famously or infamously attached to his home, where he was born, where he grew up, and where he stays.
Yeah, both of his novels are about Northampton.
Yeah. I am really dying now to read Lud Heat by Ian Sinclair.
Like sounds interesting, yeah.
It's quite a recommendation. And then it's a bit of a demystifying, because there's a bit of like, oh, you wanted to, rework Lud Heat into a chapter of your book, and you did it.
Yeah, in the way that From Hell is demystifying the Ripper murders, he's demystifying the process of writing this book. It's not like he just sat down and had all these epiphanies and was like, this is it.
Nothing leapt out of his head fully formed.
Yeah.
And then he even goes on to say, Moore does, I quickly understood that psychogeography wasn't something Ian had invented. There were all sorts of people who had made walking with an agenda, as Ian calls it, into a kind of art form. The flaneur.
Yeah.
Did we talk about the flaneur before? Or was that on another show?
I can't remember if you and I have talked about it, but it was something that came up a lot when I was in grad school. The flaneur.
Yeah. Can you describe the flaneur in 2 sentences?
You can probably do it better than I can. I feel like I would do it I would do it injustice.
The flaneur is a person who takes their wealth and luxury and funnels it all into walking the city that they live in.
They're like a dandy, kind of.
Yeah. And the flaneurs and cigarette dandies were sort of happening around the same time. Do you know that a cigarette dandy was known to smoke up to 200 cigarettes a day?
That's quite a bit. That would require a good amount of money. So I suppose you'd have to be a flaneur to do it.
And sheer force of will, too.
Yeah. So now we get into some of the pieces that are about From Hell, and one of them is by Greg Carpenter. We'll have links as usual to all of these articles on the landing page for the episode. Greg Carpenter says, from a storytelling standpoint, Moore's decision to present the chapter on psychogeography, which is what I was talking about earlier, as a barely interrupted lecture is incredibly bold. Moore himself even expressed doubts to Eddie Campbell inside the script. So this is a quote from the script. Moore to Eddie Campbell says, I spent a long while trying to think of ways to tart the strip up using continuous background panels or similar visual devices. I thought of liberally sprinkling the story with flashback panels to the ancient times that Gull is talking about. The more I thought about it, though, I went, nah. So let's describe this chapter.
Yeah, this chapter is essentially a wagon tour of a neighborhood where William Gull is being driven by Netley, his assistant, his sort of indentured assistant for this whole project. And Gull just opines and lectures and narrates on the history of the world that they are walking around in, that they are driving around in, excuse me.
Yeah, and
why the churches are shaped that way, what people existed here before, what meanings, shapes, and paths and relationships have, all the way back to the true, like, the Anglo history before the Saxons came along.
And he's specifically connecting, I think it's 5, it might be more, structures in that neighborhood that are phallic symbolic representations of, as Gull sees it, men trying to subdue women, essentially, through culture, because they don't want to return to a time where women led the world. And so there's a deeply misogynistic aspect to his occultism as well.
Yeah, and that is not explicitly the idea of why Gull was killing the women for the queen, but it's clear that it reflects it and deepens the connotations. Like, this is that sort of stacking of ideas and reflections, inferences, and connotations to make the story about so much more than Jack the Ripper was actually a well-known person who was killing under cover of darkness.
Yeah, Carpenter goes on to mention, he talks about this scene in the middle of this chapter where Gull and Netley stop for lunch and they're eating kidney pie. And he says, Moore and Campbell were able to transform a theological discussion using the medium of comics into this visual precursor of the murders themselves, as Gull is cutting through the kidney pie with his knife. And Netley, throughout the course of the chapter, is getting progressively more and more nauseated as he realizes what Gull's talking about.
It's hilarious to look at this bit from Moore's script because it breaks all the rules. We can see Gull's fork as it pierces a whole kidney, the tines puncturing the smooth outer membrane and then sliding the organ about on the plate in order that it might soak up a little more gravy. It's like that's multiple actions in one beat and things that cannot be immediately portrayed.
Classic Moore scripting, yeah. And Eddie Campbell talks about that a little bit more. We'll get into it. Going back to Tim Callahan, he says, the individual chapters of From Hell, what's interesting about them is that they get increasingly larger after the first few brief installments. So you get a chapter that's 15 pages and a chapter that's 20 pages. And then all of a sudden they're like 50 pages long. They get really long towards the middle and then they start tapering off again.
Yeah. And these are appearing in an anthology, and it didn't take 10 years because the anthology wasn't being published, right? It took 10 years because it wasn't every episode, every issue that had an installment in it. Well,
it also wasn't. It went for so long that it didn't all appear in Taboo either.
Oh yeah, it broke free. Yeah.
So Callahan points out, he says Moore had the whole structure for this story mapped out, but he left the length of each chapter unknown so that the moments within them could grow organically. And so he went from 8 to 16 page openers to 40 to 50 page chapters. And then they shrink back down in the final few. At the end, you get 66 pages of appendices. And then there's the 42 of which are the annotations that Moore has written. And then another 24 is another entire comic book that we just talked about, The Dance of the Gull Catchers, which is about the history of people trying to solve the Ripper murders.
Yeah. And a rejection of the idea that anything here is solved.
Mm-hmm.
So the graphic novel, the published book, which is quite beautiful, and this is the top shelf edition that I'm talking about. The published book is a completely different... Yeah, mine is about that, like that, yeah.
This is a second edition
paperback.
Yeah, it's like a phone book.
Mine has the line drawing of Gull holding the scalpel or the knife.
Oh, yeah. I think that's the version that they put out after the movie. Yeah.
I think so, yeah. And luckily it does not have a photograph from the movie as the tie-in.
Johnny Depp and Heather Graham.
But my point is that the experience of reading From Hell as a graphic novel is very different from your experience reading it as a serial, because the confusion of, wow, this is so much bigger. When is it going to come? This chapter is so much bigger than the last one. When is it going to come out? Where do I find it now that taboos happen, all that. And when it comes all together, it becomes this it feels like he meant it this way, because it is small chapters to get you in with some big sections in the middle. And then the crescendo, which is the time spent with the Marie Kelly murder, and then smaller chapters, the denouement, and then back matter, which actually totally expands the work. It is not, I think they're called appendices, but they are fundamental parts of the whole experience.
Yeah, I agree. Yeah. We spent a lot of time talking about Alan Moore. Let's talk about Eddie Campbell. So, if you're not familiar with his other work, he's a British comic book artist. He's best known for this, but his main work are on two series that he self-published. One is called Alec, and one is called Bacchus. Moore said when they first talked about working on this that he knew that he wanted to work with somebody who didn't have an ordinary comic book style. And then when Eddie was pitched to him, he said, now I can't think of anybody other than Eddie for this book. And this is an Alan Moore quote about Eddie's work. He says, I've heard less informed people describe his art as scratchy or unfinished and unrealistic. These are generally people whose idea of realism is over-rendered superhero comics. Eddie's stuff is actually very realistic, because when you look at things in life, they don't have a fine line that's drawn around them. Every detail is not immediately apparent. And he creates incredibly believable naturalism. All the scenes look like they're taking place in the same world. There's no sudden excursion into, quote, horror world. So this is a point I want to make. Campbell does not do horror work on his own. His own stories are kind of slice of life stuff.
Yeah, isn't Bacchus a autobiography, like a disguised and
kind
expressionistic autobiography?
Yeah.
Now, I have to cop to being one of the uninformed people or less informed people. I do think of Eddie Campbell's art as scratchy. I feel a little bit defensive when the end of that sentence is. Yeah, right. It was when over-rendered superhero comics is my idea of realism, if I think that Eddie Campbell's art is scratchy. But I think it struck me a lot because I went from Providence to From Hell.
Oh, yeah. Those are two very different artists. Yeah.
So Alan Moore's collaborator for Neonomicon and From Hell is Jason Burrows, who is almost photorealistic. Almost. Really precise, and yet still clearly comics.
That's interesting. I wouldn't describe Jason Burrows as photorealistic, but I think that Jason Burrows' work, he has more precise lines that define the textures and faces. Mm-hmm. And that Eddie Campbell works in black and white, and he works in a dead line weight, which is why I think it looks scratchy, because it looks like it was like literally scratched with a knife, which, is kind of apropos for this book. And so the way that Eddie Campbell creates textures is through repetition and cross-hatching, whereas like Jason Burrows also uses a dead line, but he puts most of his detail into the features of like a face or a building or something like that, and then he lets the colors flesh out the texture.
Yeah, and I think that's why, obviously, photorealism has a very particular meaning that is not Jason Burrows, but I think that's why I think of it as photographic, or seemingly more photographic, because he tricks me. Mm-hmm. His art tricks me into seeing it as reality, instead of Eddie Campbell's work, which sort of asks me to take it in.
Yeah. Yeah, I agree. And Eddie Campbell's work feels surreal in a way. I mean, Jason Burrows does as well when there's the occult stuff going on in Neonomicon or Providence. But so this, I love this quote from Alan Moore. He cites Hookjaw as his inspiration for why Eddie was the perfect artist. And I love it because Hookjaw is one of my favorite all-time comics. Have I told you about this before?
No, and I do want to point out that I think that he's using Hookjaw to explain what his thinking was. He did not say, "Oh, you know what? Hookjaw makes it clear that I should use Eddie Campbell."
No, but it just goes to show you Alan Moore's frame of reference. So he says the thought behind having Eddie be the choice is best illustrated for him by describing Hookjaw. Hookjaw was this, again, an anthology comic that was in a British boys book that was called Action. I think Hookjaw and Action were in the early 70s. And, well, no, it must have been later because it was a Jaws ripoff. So the idea behind Hookjaw, the pitch, would be this shark, a great white shark, is pissed off because once upon a time someone tried to kill it, a human being, with a javelin, and that javelin got stuck in its jaw and pokes out through the bottom of its jaw. That's how you can recognize Hookjaw. And Hookjaw swims around the world, and every issue is Hookjaw just absolutely shredding people to death. And usually Hookjaw's victims are corporate bad guys, like somebody who wants to start an oil platform and refuses to move because like of the ecological impact the platform is going to have, or like somebody who owns a tourist area on a beach or something. These Hookjaw comics, they're hilarious. The gore is so over the top. But this is what Alan Moore, I'm going to bring it back around to the Eddie Campbell stuff. He says, one of the things about Hookjaw is that not the first artist, but one of the later artists on Hookjaw wasn't a horror artist. He had drawn romance comics. And so he would get these scripts, and the scripts would basically be like, here, show a severed arm on a beach. And the way that this artist would render these drawings, it didn't look like it was meant to be horrific. It was meant to be realistic and kind of just the frame and the shot and the way everything was set. He says it made it so detached that it made it 10 times more horrible, because it wasn't saying, hey, you're watching a horror film, you're reading a girl's adventure story, and all of a sudden there's a severed arm on a beach.
Yeah, and he compares it to like the original artist and the sort of overall style of ta-da, look how gross it is. You know, talking about how the severed arm on the beach for the original artist of Hookjaw would be like a close-up of the edge of the arm, and it would be all about the gross out.
And so that's what he wanted to capture with Eddie Campbell, this sort of removed, detached, clinical look at these horrific events.
And just an eye toward story, not toward, haha, look, the knife.
Yeah. So Eddie Campbell has been interviewed a lot in the last year or two about From Hell, because he is currently working on what is referred to as the From Hell Masters Edition. And as we're recording this, I think it's like halfway through publication. The idea, we'll get to this a little bit later, is that he is going back and coloring the entire project using computer coloring, which wasn't available to him at the time. And during the coloring process is adding some stuff to it to sort of flesh out the drawings. And
he said he's catching the mistakes, things that he looks at and says, oh no, that's no good.
So there's been a lot of like rethinking From Hell in the last year or two. And he says, we worked on this in 1988. And it was 30 years ago at the time that he was being interviewed. And he said, then we finished it 20 years ago in 1998. There's this invisible curve that rises through the centuries. Can history then be said to have an architecture? That notion is most glorious, but it's also most horrible. And this is another one of the major themes of From Hell.
And Campbell fills in some of the story that we referenced earlier. For the second issue of Taboo, they were looking to start creating a comic, Alan Moore's comic about the Jack the Ripper murders. And Campbell says, in the first issue of that anthology, I wrote a peculiar and disturbing little story titled The Pajama Girl. I must have seemed an odd choice at the time because horror was not a subject that I had dipped into, and The Pajama Girl was almost unclassifiable. But Alan wanted to come at this thing from an unusual angle. Several chapters would appear before anybody except Ripperologists knew it would be about the Whitechapel murders or any murders. It was important to set our events in a world of studied normality.
He also points out, you were talking about earlier about sort of the idea that like, well, Alan Moore had this cachet, so he could get away with doing whatever he wanted to do. And Eddie Campbell says, you've got to remember that when we started out in England in the 1980s making comics, the business was foreign to us. And so we felt that we had a liberty and we were compelled to make up our own ways of doing comics. And so he says, this is why Alan Moore's scripts are so notoriously long. He writes them in such a way that he sees the whole thing complete in his head, and then he describes what he sees in precise detail. He scripts a picture that works because he sees it as a picture in his head. He doesn't see a movie. He doesn't have some recollection of something that may or may not have once taken place. He describes a single picture down to telling you what size it is, what the characters are wearing, what the background details are, and then he describes the picture next to it. And if there are 8 pictures on the page instead of 9 with 2 portions of the grid adjoined to make one larger image, then he'll tell me which one to put on the right at the top. Much of this is beautifully poetic, and I often thought it was sad that I was the only one reading the script at all.
And so this is in stark contrast to the Marvel method.
Oh, God,
right?
yeah. Yeah.
Or the sort of more regimented DC method, right? Where, you know, a script like a film script that you adapt into a comic page, or a script like a short story that you're on your own when you're drawing.
Yeah. And it's kind of fascinating to compare and contrast the work. You know, I mean, I think Campbell is doing his best to remain faithful to Moore's vision, but at the same time, there's no way he could possibly include everything that Moore asks to be in a panel. And so what you see is the compromise, and I think both Moore and Campbell are comfortable with that compromise.
Yeah. I think that Alan Moore's scripts must be useful to the artist even when they cannot possibly do what he says. Like, what's the one that keeps sticking out for me? I wish I could remember exactly, but it's like the sunset looks like the slit wrist of a suicide.
Okay. Yeah,
something like that.
That sounds, vaguely
the,
Swamp Thing-ish.
Like blood seeping through the bandages around a wrist. And certainly that's not helpful in the sense that, you know, that doesn't give you what you're doing. But tonally, right, aesthetically, like overall, the overall push of the work lives in all of those weird little descriptions and can kind of give the artist a way to understand what are they in for? What are they trying to encompass?
Moore thinks about comic scripting as beyond just describing the plot to the artist and having them render a plot. Yeah. He thinks about symbology, he thinks about context, he thinks about pacing. I don't think there's anywhere in here where they spend a lot of time talking about the grid, but From Hell, like Watchmen, is done entirely in a 9-panel grid, and that helps the pace quite a bit, and it allows Moore and Campbell to control when it slows down, when it speeds up. A lot of the transitions in here are moment-to-moment transitions rather than jumping around through time and space, although there's some of that too.
Yeah, but even when there is, as Tim Callahan writes, From Hell has a steady rhythm, like a metronome or ticking clock.
Yeah. So Greg Carpenter in his piece about From Hell says that Campbell seemed intent to keep From Hell pure by avoiding any visual tricks or artificial gimmicks. And he and Moore sometimes ended up in different directions in that respect. So if you read Moore's original scripts and then you compare them to Campbell's drawings, you can see some of this. One of the ones he points out is like when Netley first appears in the book, Alan Moore has this panel where he's like, all right, we're going to close in on his face and we want his face to stay in readers' minds. Bear in mind, this is going to be a man who's a cocky and egotistical little sod who's ruthlessly ambitious, you know, and Campbell can't render that.
Yeah. There's nothing in there that he can draw immediately, but he's, you know, if he's going to draw a face, now he knows that little piece of the person, and it can kind of cook in his head until the next time he draws it.
So, and you see, this is one of the, I need to get this, the companion book or the compendium, whatever it is. It's been on sale a couple times and I've almost picked it up, but I haven't had a chance to read it yet. When you look at the way Moore writes to Campbell, this is another thing about Moore's scripts. They're written like letters. He writes them to the artist.
Because Campbell was in Australia at the time.
Yeah.
So they were internationally collaborating in a time when there was not... you and I live in a very different world than Alan Moore and Eddie Campbell, because you're in Portland and I'm in Atlanta. And the biggest problem we have looking each other in the eye is that you can't quite get your face in the right place in the frame to look at the camera eye and at the screen at the same time.
Yeah. And yeah, I remember reading stories and interviews with these guys about the process too. Like Moore would like send a couple pages via fax to Eddie Campbell, and then Eddie Campbell for like the resources. Like I remember some story about how Eddie Campbell would like have to go to an office to get the fax printed for him. Right. And then like he would take a cab over to the parts of town where he needed to like take photos for the resources so he could get the references, actually, right? Yeah, no, you're getting a little bit mixed up there. Eddie Campbell had to hire someone from a distance. That's it.
To go and take pictures in Whitechapel. So actually we've got some stuff in the notes here. So Moore would have things in his script like notes that say, see how nervous I get when I'm working with a respected comic book theorist like yourself. All that writing and wriggling just to assure you I'm not getting flashy. And so Campbell says, nowadays, when we want a photo of something, we Google it. But in 1988, we had to get down to the library, and if we couldn't find it, tough. I slipped a pal 10 quid to run a reel of photos of Cleveland Street, for instance. Then I'd have to wait 2 weeks for the mail because I was living in Australia. We can Google it and find everything on the internet now. I can find photographs of buildings that no longer exist that I couldn't find before.
Yeah, he's got a lot of interesting points about, and I think that's part of why he wants to revisit it now. Also, I mean, let's be honest, the publisher and Eddie Campbell are probably going to make some good money off of the republished version as well, and that will allow Eddie Campbell to continue making his indie comics how he wants to make them, probably for the rest of his life.
And I'm sure Alan Moore is delighted to have a project, based on his work that he doesn't have to disavow.
Well, I don't know about that.
Well, wait, he's not going to say, no, I have nothing to do with the master. Is he?
We'll get to that. So
holy shit, what did you find?
Eddie Campbell's been interviewed about this process, and he's like, I told Alan, and he hasn't responded. Basically.
Okay. Yeah. Just as a side note then, what I'm talking about is the sort of now notorious habit that Alan Moore has of declaring that any film adaptation of his work, he doesn't want any of the money, just give it to the artist and take my name off it.
Which I think is what happened with the From Hell film.
Yeah, I'm sure. Yeah. Credit me as the original writer if you have to credit me, and otherwise I want nothing to do with it. So I'm saying I have to assume that the new editions of From Hell would at least still be credited to him and that he would still get the money.
His name is on them, and they're published through Top Shelf and Knockabout, so I think he's comfortable taking those checks.
Whom he's been working with already. Yeah. But you're saying that he maybe has no interest in actually participating.
That's what it sounds like from Eddie Campbell in these interviews. We're kind of skipping ahead here, but Eddie Campbell has said, like, I reached out to Alan and I was like, hey, I'm going to do this. The publisher wants to do this. Are you cool with it? He never really responded. And then they had some communication about it later. And he said, you've been talking for like 20 years now about how you want to do another appendices, kind of like the Dance of the Gull Catchers. If we're going to do it, now's the time to do it.
Yeah.
And Moore's kind of like, I don't know. Because I think not as much that he's disavowing the project as much as Moore is like, I'm not doing comics anymore.
Yeah, this is not my work now. Mm-hmm. But but you don't have to take your name. He doesn't have to take his name off the colorized version.
Right. No, I don't. Yeah, I don't think he probably feels that way about it.
Okay, we did jump ahead. Let's come back to what we were talking about. Eddie Campbell sort of describing his process doing From Hell. They were continents apart, and so a lot of this was by mail. He was the artist was far away from what he was drawing, both in time and in space. And then also he was detached from Ripperology, right?
Yeah, he wasn't as interested in this as Moore was, but he quickly became interested because it was a 10-year project. Some opinions, yeah. Yeah, and Eddie Campbell does a really good job of summarizing why this is important too, not just the book From Hell, but overall analyzing the Jack the Ripper murderers. He says, Jack the Ripper was the first of the great evil serial murderers. Before that, evil men tended to be kings or emperors or generals, people who were in position of power. We don't even know who Jack the Ripper was. He could have been some scallywag who escaped from the lunatic asylum. He could have been a complete nobody. I think this is the reason for conspiracy theories. This is extremely relevant right now.
Yes.
Eddie Campbell. They want it to be a person in a position of power. Conspiracy theories exist because we want to feel that everything that goes wrong in the world is perpetrated by the people in power. We can't bear the thought that evil and horror are random. We want to think it's under control, even if it's the control of the people who are governing us. We can't live with the idea that it's just all chaos. We want there to be a pattern to it all. And that's what From Hell really is. It makes a pattern out of all of this madness.
And he goes as far as to say, I think the real William Gull must have been wonderful. He was probably a great man. Eddie Campbell, I guess, is famously cool with the royals. He says, I even like Queen Victoria. I think we've maligned her.
Well, there was notoriously like a little bit of friction between him and Moore about including Victoria in the story. He didn't want to malign her.
Right. So he talks about William Gull. He says, as a doctor, Gull wrote the paper analyzing and giving the name to anorexia nervosa. This was one of the things he achieved. He's not just this obscure figure. He did things that are still relevant to the present age. He was the first man to understand anorexia and give it a name, and we've made him, we being him and Alan Moore, we've made him into a madman. I prefer to think we've created a madman who just happens to have the same name as him. I think we've created a villain on the scale of Hannibal Lecter.
As my nightmare tells me, I think he might be right. Which leads us to talking about the publishing on this. We've hinted around about it. We've talked about Taboo, but let's get into the nitty-gritty. So Taboo magazine was published by a company called Spider Baby Graphics that comics artist Steve Bissette put out. And it was published from 1988 to 1992. And then Kitchen Sink Press put out the last couple of issues in 1995. Taboo bounced around between companies like Tundra Publishing, Kitchen Sink, and eventually these stories landed at Top Shelf. The graphic novel version that I have doesn't even have Top Shelf's logo on it. It's just Eddie Campbell Comics. And then I think Top Shelf handled the distribution on those.
Yeah, in the U.S.
Yeah.
Because Top Shelf is right here. And then they've been reprinting it with a Top Shelf label on it.
Yeah, so this is the history. So you go from Spider Baby Graphics to a company called Tundra Publishing. Tundra was based out of Northampton, Massachusetts, and it was owned by Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles creator Kevin Eastman. It started in 1990, and was a creator-owned company. They published things like Scott McCloud's Understanding Comics, Alan Moore and Bill Sienkiewicz's Big Numbers, Alan Moore and Melinda Gibby's Lost Girls, and other books like The Crow, Madman, and Dave McKean's Cages. Sorry, I was thinking of Taboo earlier. It was Tundra. Tundra was never profitable and closed 3 years after it started after spending $14 million.
But look at what it did.
Oh, yeah. I mean, the work that they published is nuts. It is some of the highest quality stuff in the medium, especially from that time, but it wasn't sustainable. And I should mention at the time, because I lived in Massachusetts then, I was living overseas then, but I'm from Massachusetts, and my family lives in Northampton, Massachusetts. Kevin Eastman also had a museum to comics in downtown Northampton. So it was pretty cool because you could go down to that museum at the time. I think it was called the Words and Picture Museum. And you could see like original art from this stuff and other projects like on the walls. They had like original like Frank Miller art from Sin City and Elektra and stuff like that.
It is hilarious that it's Northampton, Massachusetts publishing this when Northampton, England is the place that Alan Moore is ensconced in, wedged into.
And then the next company that picks it up is also based in Northampton, Massachusetts.
I guess Dennis just heard Kevin talking one day at the bar.
Probably. Look, Northampton ain't that big. So Dennis Kitchen, he'd been running Kitchen Sink Press since 1970. That company closed in 1999, and at the time they were based in Northampton, and so when Tundra closed down, they picked it up and were publishing From Hell.
and not just From Hell, Kitchen Sink acquired Northampton's holdings.
All of it. Yeah, exactly. All of it. And then when the collected version came out, so I think what happened was Eddie Campbell printed his own versions and then had them distributed depending on who helped him around the world. In America, it was Top Shelf. Top Shelf is an American comic book publisher founded in 1997 by Chris Staros and Brett Warnock. They are based in Atlanta, just outside of Atlanta, in Marietta, Georgia.
They're based in Marietta, Georgia. Don't be calling that Atlanta.
Oh, sorry. I forgot that how you suburbanites like to keep your identity and your taxes separate.
Interesting that that's what you're taking from me. Marietta is a completely different culture than Atlanta. It's kind of extraordinary. Marietta has a town square.
I've been.
That's the kind of place it is.
Yes, it is. It is certainly one kind of place.
And you know what? Let's talk about that a little bit, because it is also kind of crazy to imagine that Top Shelf Productions that prints all this stuff that is subversive and wild and offensive or confrontational, whatever you want to call it,
sure,
is in Marietta, Georgia, which is kind of known for being
it is like the most homogenous conservative place you can imagine. Yeah. So Staros is I would refer to him as a hero of comics. He's just one of the nicest guys that I've ever had the pleasure of communicating with in comics, and he's just deeply in love with the medium and really dedicated to it. I should mention, so Staros lives in Marietta. Brett Warnock, I think, lived here in Portland or maybe in Seattle, and they were running the company from either side of the country.
Okay.
But just recently, a couple of years ago, IDW bought Top Shelf. So now editions of From Hell that come out, they have the Top Shelf logo on them, but they're owned by IDW Publishing.
Okay. And is it Top Shelf or IDW that has this roster that we have in the notes?
So these are all Top Shelf creators, but their work is now owned. But not their work, but the books are published through IDW.
So Craig Thompson, James Kolchaka, Andy Runton, Nate Powell, Alex Robinson, Jeff Lemire, and Matt Kint. And
the big book that most people probably know Top Shelf from now is March, which is the John Lewis book that Nate Powell drew about the civil rights movement. That's like one of their biggest sellers.
Yeah. So I was going to say, Nate Powell is the only one of those that I can think of his work right away because of March. Lemire and Kint look familiar. Have we talked about them before?
You've read some Lemire books. You mentioned to me that you read Jeff Lemire's Moon Knight run or something like that.
Oh, is that okay? That's who that is. Yeah.
Yeah. And Matt Kent I like Matt. I like both of those guys quite a bit, but Matt Kent is based out of St. Louis and does a bunch of indie comics as well.
Okay. So Lemire was the artist on Warren Ellis's reboot of Moon Knight, right?
No. Jeff Lemire wrote the follow-up to Warren Ellis's Moon Knight.
Oh, okay. No, I stopped before. I stopped when Warren Ellis stopped. I just read it and then I moved on. But let us not make this into the inevitable Warren Ellis super context that it could become, and move on to another distributor that we should mention, Knockabout Comics, which is a United Kingdom publisher of alternative comics, founded in 1973 as Hassle Free Press, changed to Knockabout in 1978. They've also published work by Robert Crumb, Ryan Hughes, and they are a co-publisher of Alan Moore's League of Extraordinary Gentlemen. It's funny to see, like, okay, so there's all these presses and publishers in America, but Knockabout handled it in England.
Well, they handle it now in England. I don't know what the situation was before then. I wonder even if you could get Taboo magazine in England. I'd be curious to hear from our English listeners if the serialized versions of From Hell were even available, because these are all American publishers, and they were really operating with thin margins. You know, Kitchen Sink, Tundra, and Taboo they're like kind of legends now when you look back at the history of indie publishing, but you know, I don't think anybody was scraping big money off of this. I mean, Kevin Eastman lost $14 million. I would imagine that came from Turtles money.
Yeah.
That he was like, I got some extra cash here. I'm going to do a publisher and put out some great work that I see from other people in the medium.
Yeah. So because of Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles, we have Understanding Comics.
And From Hell. Yeah.
Okay. Let's take a break. I'm going to see if I got any of the Eastman Laird stuff up on the bookshelf here. And when we come back, we'll talk about how people responded to From Hell when it came out. Well, Chris, here is the traditional spot for our Patreon message. And I'm not feeling really motivated to deliver too much of that today.
Oh, wow. Really? Were you only motivated by the cash this entire time?
Yeah, that's what I was motivated by, Chris. You got me.
So, we usually do our Patreon spot here, where we ask you, the listener, to support the podcast so that we can keep it going. However, one episode from now, we're going to stop the regular podcast. What we will be doing is continuing to host the feed on supercontextpodcast.libsyn.com, and we're looking for support to keep it up there. So if you are a patron or you want to be a patron, the way to help us out is to join us on patreon.com/supercontext. So many URLs. And support us with $1 a month.
That's right. And we only want $1 a month from anybody. There are no rewards beyond the occasional check-in from Chris and I doing a mini-sode. We just want to keep the RSS feed up and active for as long as we can, because people seem to enjoy the show, and they enjoy finding the show through one episode and then listening to as much of it as they can. So we just want to keep it out there for a little bit longer.
Yeah, we actually didn't even intend on this show ending right in the middle of a quarantine pandemic, but we've had several requests for us to keep doing the show. At the very least, I would like to keep the 4 years worth of episodes that we've recorded up and public so new people can get something out of it.
Now, if you've ever heard the show before, you probably know that now come the thank yous. We're going to say thank you to all the people who are supporting us on Patreon right now, because they're the reason that this show has gone on as long as it has and why it has gotten as good as it did. So, thank you to, I'll be damned, our newest Patreon supporters. Thanks for jumping in right at the end, Chris Ragland and Adam Nygren. You're great. And I wonder if you'll stick around once you discover that we're going to stop producing episodes. But thank you. And also, thank you, Alex Laird, Alice Florence, Ambrose Allen, Amit Doshi, Andy Riggs, BB Schwells, Bennett Callahan, Beth Barnett, Beth Gilmore, Billy Whitehouse, Bing Bong Man, Brandon Daniels, Brian Chauvinich, Caroline Zoids, Chris Marlton, Cliff Landis, Coco, Dave Jordan, and Dave Wachter.
Wow, that was an impressive haul there, Charlie. Thank you also to Elijah Tilstra, Evan Mapstone, Fred Rasco, H.A. Eugene, Ira James Udiskin, James McDonnell, Jason Puckett, Jim Taylor, Jess Staten, John Klima, John Pheasant, Joseph Aleo, Juan Patton, Junta/Cult, Calvin Ellis, Carmela Padovich, Kate Sharon, Kevin Wetter, Christian Hirfula, and Lee Fowler.
And thank you Lokesh Dakar, Luciano Fuck, Luigi Oswego, Melinda Hale, Miriam Meany, Misha Moon, Nathan Weatherford, Nick Sage, Patrick Malka, Pete Bow, Philip, R.M. Rhodes, the podcast Rein It In, Matt and Rachel, Roar Vinland, Rob Sloan, Robert Negoesco, and Roman Marichik.
And thank you to Romantic Placebo, Ron Bilodeau, Ross Llewellyn, Ryan O'Neill, Sari Nichols, Seth Friedman, Simon Workman, Thomas Tremberger, Vielheit, and Whitney Buchanan.
Thank you, everybody. And we're back. Well, Chris, this one gets the awards.
It does. It does indeed. Which is surprising given how, it wasn't readily available. But clearly the comics industry regarded this as something very special, even before it was collected.
Yeah. So let's see. I see 5 Eisners, Best Serialized Story, 3 Best Writer, and 1 Best Graphic Album. The Harvey Award for Continuing or Limited Series, Best Graphic Album of Previously Published Work. So it got awards while it was happening, and then it started getting awards when it was collected and published, republished.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
It also won awards that I have never heard of, that have not managed to make its way into the Super Context recordings before. The Eagle Award, the Angoulême Prix de la Critique.
That's pretty good. Yeah, Angoulême, I believe, is how it's pronounced. Yeah.
The Comics Buyer's Guide Fan Award, the International Horror Guild Award, and the Ignatz Award.
So one of the things
which ones of those do you know?
I know all of them. But
okay.
What's interesting about this is that this is the only book I think that we've covered on this entire 4 years of the show that has won awards across the spectrum. So the Ignatz Awards are given at SPX every year, Small Press Expo. Those are small press, really indie-focused awards. They're very rarely overlapping with the Eisner Awards. And Angoulême is a French comics convention that is regarded as like one of the best comics conventions in the world by creators. So for that convention to then also recognize this as like a great piece of work shows you that like across the spectrum of comic book creators, publishers, different countries, different genres, different areas and distributors, everybody recognizes this as like, this is a great piece of work.
Yeah. And important, like outstanding story, right? Mm-hmm. Narrative. Like these awards are not just for the writer, just for the artist. They are writer and artist.
So I've been to the Eisners, the Harveys, and the Ignatz Awards, and they are all very different affairs. I would imagine Angoulême is even more different. Hopefully one day I'll be able to make it out there.
You have you found numbers, but they're kind of all over the place, and I don't know that I can understand them exactly.
So let's use our usual caveat here. These are direct market numbers, which means that they are what's reported to have been sold to the stores, not what the stores themselves have sold, and that this also excludes the book market. So we're not talking about copies that have been sold through Amazon or at Barnes & Noble or at your local bookstore. These are only through direct market comic book stores in the United States. At the same time, they give us a general idea of what kind of sales there are on these things.
Yeah. I cannot remember where I bought my copy.
So the numbers go back to when this was being published in single issues. So Taboo came out, and then I think the last couple issues of From Hell were published as like single pamphlets. And number 10 was published by Eddie Campbell, and it sold 9,154 copies. And that sounds like a very small number. It is the highest number in any of these printings. That
sounds like a very small number for a revered and influential comic. One issue. And so then you might say, oh, well, it probably, once it got collected and was being published, that it then started to really catch. And the original trade of the collected issues, we have 5,200 copies.
Yeah. So, I mean, this thing, remember, like, we've talked before about how, like, comic book numbers are relatively small comparatively to other media, right? And that as we're recording this, the comic book industry is imploding. But just prior to us recording
like most industries, Chris, come on now.
I would say, like, a good sales figure for a book would be 10,000. And if you did somewhere between 10 and 20,000, that would be enough to keep a book ongoing. Higher than that would be gangbusters, right?
Yeah.
But remember, this is 25 years ago. So these numbers are even lower in comparison for the 90s.
And also, you have a couple of years on here where you just slid the insult into the list. The trade has a listed sales figure of 70 copies in 2000.
Yeah. So I saw this, and I saw that single years had multiple copies sold to stores. So what I think must have been going on is Top Shelf was probably printing new editions, and those were getting shipped out to stores. Like, maybe they only shipped 70 copies because that's all they had left, and then they shipped out more later that year. But the records show that in 2000, this sold 70 copies.
Yeah, and then 2012 is 487.
Yeah.
With then another sale of 2,300, and then another sale 2 years later of 2,000. So it's like somewhere in there is a news story or a promotional thing or...
there's a little movie called From Hell that came out.
Wasn't that earlier than 2012?
Oh, yeah. I think that came out, I'm going to guess, mid-2000s, 2005.
Yeah.
Let's see.
So so what I'm looking at is not a steady demand. This is something that comes in and out of the cultural consciousness. And not, there wasn't some spike when the movie came out that we can see on these numbers, right?
Right. So I just looked it up. The movie came out in 2001. So that means that the serialized version of this, despite having sales this small, still word of mouth reached the Hughes brothers. And that it was only when this was probably first published as a collected edition in 99 that they got their hands on it, and they were like, let's turn this into a movie. They shot the movie, and then it came out a year later.
Oh, so these 2,000 copies, the 70 copies in the year 2000, that was the people who got the newsletter from the Hughes brothers.
Maybe. But these are tiny, 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 tiny numbers. Like, insultingly small numbers for what is regarded as one of the best graphic novels in the world.
Yeah.
We've got... Slipcase edition came out in 2015. That only sold 500 copies in the direct market. In 2016, the hardcover edition was published. That only sold 830 copies.
So the only thing that we can maybe pull from this, like, it's clear that From Hell is respected and known.
Yeah.
So maybe its sales numbers really do exist in the book market. Amazon, maybe. Barnes and Noble, whatever you want to, however you want to classify it.
Yeah.
That it jumped the boundary of the comic book store.
Right. Yeah, I would hope so. And we don't have access to those numbers. I will just say anecdotally that I bought mine in 1999, 2000, and my cover price is $35 US, and I remember that being exorbitant at the time.
I remember that. Like, I think I took 2 tries to buy it because, like, the first time I looked at it and said, "Oh, I don't know. I don't know if I can."
I was like, I really like this guy's stuff, but wow, that's a commitment.
And now I've got the slipcase edition of Providence back there that cost me $200 or something. And I bought that because I wanted to have it.
Yeah. So, there's I think like probably the newer versions are a little bit cheaper than this. And hell, you can read this on Hoopla now for free. But just to give us some present day context, we do have numbers on the master editions that are being put out right now. These are the versions that Top Shelf and Knockabout are publishing, where Eddie Campbell has recolored everything.
Yeah.
The 3rd issue of that sold 2,400 copies.
2 comic book stores.
2 comic books. Well, I don't think bookstores have access to single issues. I think it's only going to comic book stores.
Yeah. Well, I just wanted to re-say that.
Yeah.
Like, this is the direct market.
Yeah. There's no book market involved here. And then the 5th issue, which I think is the last issue as of this recording, sold 2,163 copies. This is just, I mean, look, I don't own those either. I love this book. I just said this is one of my favorite books in the world, and I'm waiting for the trade on those.
Right. Now, we've already talked about these master editions a little bit, so let's do a quick summation. Eddie Campbell said that he got a phone call, like, hey, let's do something new. Let's put it out again. And he thought that they would have to do something very serious about giving it a new edition. And he suggested colorizing it. And the publisher said, this is all Eddie Campbell, okay? He says the publisher said, that's not going to work, is it? It's always been black and white. And then he sent them a couple pages, and they said, okay, let's get it done right now. Like, the colorized version sold the publisher immediately.
It's pretty gorgeous. Like, when I first heard about it, I was like, no, thank you. And then I saw the samples that Campbell had done, and they look great.
Well, he seems to be really enjoying it, and computer technology is allowing him to do stuff that he really couldn't have imagined doing before.
Yeah.
Like changing the black ink lines to different colors when he's colorizing. So instead of those like scratchy knife edge lines and then having to put color on top of it, he's actually able to go back and change it. He said
that's referred to as color holds in coloring.
Okay.
So the idea is that you're changing the color of the actual ink, and so he's able to, like, if there's a spot of blood on the floor, he's able to turn the black ink into red ink, but also have the ink that was drawing the floor be brown, potentially. So there's a lot more depth and texture.
And he says that he's also, in a way, sprucing up a few things. He says, I'm revising for color, clarity, and continuity. I can go in and clarify what's going on. He says an artist can get lazy occasionally. There was one, he said, it seemed like during the psychogeography chapter that they might have been riding in a different wagon from one panel to the next.
Yeah, he actually says there were points in which the way that he was drawing was purposefully obscure because they couldn't account for historical anomalies. So he developed a style of what he calls deniability, where we could say, oh, we didn't really know what that looked like. It's not meant to be so-and-so or whatever. Like, so spoilers for this story, but there's like a twist in which like the final murder, the person who's murdered is not meant to be Marie Kelly. She's meant to have escaped.
In the story. In the story that Alan Moore has written.
Yeah. But Eddie Campbell was like, sometimes you can't tell whether or not it's the same character or not. Sometimes that required foggy drawing, and there was a lot of soft focus on things that aren't supposed to be soft focus. We were only hinting at some things. And he said, that's why From Hell has a certain look. It's like you're seeing evidence from the back of a galloping horse.
I'll go with that. It takes a little time to get used to, for me, it took a little time to get used to the style and to sort of accept it. But then it does like work some magic once you've been reading it for a while.
When I first read it, I remember that being my experience too, that I was like, oh, this is a different language of comics than I'm used to. And it was like, it took me about halfway through before I really understood how to read it. And I'll be honest, every time I read this book, I get something different out of it.
Yeah.
I know now when I read it the first time, I did not understand the psychogeography stuff, the Freemason stuff.
Oh, for sure. It operates like a novel in that way, that it does have it reveals power as you move through it.
Yeah, yeah.
Now, you talked a little bit about the gull catcher stuff, the sort of ripperology, the piss taking of the ripperology stuff. And Eddie Campbell says that he did finally connect to Alan Moore, to say, hey, do you want to do this? And Alan Moore said, I guess this is the only time we could do it. But Eddie Campbell finally says, I'm not promising anything, because we'll probably have to beat Alan Moore up to get it out of him. We'll have to tie him to the computer and make him type it out.
Yeah, so we'll see. I mean, hey, the coronavirus has given them a couple months of leeway there. So hopefully, I think those color editions were coming out like an issue every 2 months or something like that. So presumably it would have been finished by the end of 2020.
Yeah. We're talking about consumption. We've mentioned the film adaptation. I've not seen it. Chris has. Chris is very dismissive of it. Let's give Glenn Miller a chance to just tell you exactly why the movie is not really something to connect to the work. Miller writes, the spine of From Hell is the conspiracy story and, of course, the murders, often depicted in scratchy horror by Eddie Campbell. And indeed, strip all the other stuff Moore's thrown in, then you can just end up with the vapid film starring Johnny Depp. From Hell as a comic is much more than just a murder mystery.
It's a weird movie. I haven't seen it since it came out, so I guess it's been 19 years since I've seen it, but I was really disappointed, I remember at the time, because, like I said, like I was like buying these like Jack the Ripper books, and I was like so into it. And yeah, the movie is just, it's exactly what you would expect from a Hollywood thing. It's not a bad movie, but they just drain all of the context out of it and just turn it into a whodunit.
Yeah. And in 2015, FX was developing a From Hell drama with the producer of the movie. I haven't heard anything more about that. Have you?
No. I'll just say, doesn't it sometimes feel like FX is purposely designing content just for our generation?
Oh my God. So the Hulu FX channel, that just sort of puts it all up there. I do feel like, this is my demographic.
Yeah.
So yeah, I'm with you.
I feel the same way about FX that I feel about like A24 films. It feels like they've like laser focused targeted my demographic and are just like, yep, here you go. Here's some more stuff. I mean, there's occasionally things that come out by them that I'm like, I'm not really interested in. But even that stuff, I'm like, okay, that's probably good. It's just not for me.
Well, this is back to a discussion we had when we were talking about Hyperion. Like the age of people who work in positions of power in media companies.
Yeah.
Right, means that now they're starting to tap the stuff that they're starting to go back. One of the 2,000 people who bought the trade, right, is saying, what can we do with this? Oh shit, Don Murphy owns the rights because they made that movie. Let's go get him.
Right. Well, it's been 5 years and nothing's happened with that. And honestly, I'd be really surprised if even an FX series was able to do an adaptation justice. But there's always time to tell, so we'll see.
Yeah.
So a big theme of this book is about gender and power structures and class and power structures in Victorian England. And so I think that it's important for us to talk about representation in here, especially in light of, Alan Moore is notorious for being accused of fetishizing sexual violence in his works. And this is a story that's all about sexual violence. It's predicated upon an instance of real sexual violence. And yet it sounds like from the interviews that Moore genuinely was trying to do something to represent the women in a way that they hadn't been represented before.
Yeah. And the way they did that is by representing the world that these women existed in and the choices they had to make. They did not place modern women into a time period so that, you know, you would be titillated by someone who looked like,
Heather Graham.
Heather Graham, women now. As Miller, Glenn Miller, who we already quoted a little bit, says, Moore and Campbell don't flinch in showing us the grim, hellish life of working-class sex workers in the 19th century and the poverty of the East End of London. It is then also put into stark relief with the class differences between William Gull, private doctor to the Queen, and the life that Prince Albert is, you know, performing some kind of sexual cultural tourism in.
Yeah.
You know, and you know, there's a moment when these women gather and they hatch a plan to blackmail royalty, blackmail the Queen.
Yeah, and they want like enough money to just pay their rent for a month. Like,
right.
They're not asking for a lot of money.
And it's totally like if someone was in a bar here in Atlanta and they were saying, okay, this is how we're going to get $1,500 from Donald Trump.
Yeah, right.
And just the utter... the inevitability. It's almost like it's like a Wire episode, you know, set in Whitechapel. The crushing effects of industrialism and capitalism are so obvious that, in a way, the kind of the release of tension that happens in a scene of murder is almost a relief compared to the conversations about how am I going to get enough rent for tonight? You know, how am I going to get enough food? What's going to happen to me? What's going to happen to my family?
Yeah, this is something that I've been thinking about a lot in terms of a story that I'm working on right now, that poverty is its own form of violence and people being hungry is violence. Mm-hmm. And that these women were already victims of violence because of that. And then these gruesome murders were an accentuation of that. Yeah. Glenn Miller, who does another one of the big like reviews of this, talking about the themes, has a passage here that I feel like speaks to why From Hell is such an important work. Miller says, I'm drawn to the book because it's a commentary on class and politics of the time, which should have died a death in the 19th century, but the tendrils of privileged class and creating inequality to benefit the wealthy via enforced governmental poverty is still relevant today, 120 or so years after the Jack the Ripper murders.
Yeah. Tim Callahan describes it as the unfolding of fate, as opposed to a mystery plot or an adventure or what's going to happen, but just this, here's what happens to people in this situation.
Yeah. There's another piece by Michael J. Prince in which Prince describes the book and says, Alan Moore establishes systemic patriarchal sexual violence as the backdrop of Victorian London. Rape and other acts of physical repression are easily linked to the notion of sexual violence. Moore treats it as a concentration on society as a whole. I'll admit, the psychogeography chapter is a lot to get through. Like, I love this piece of work, but if I were going to edit it in any way, I might ask him to cut it down like by 20 pages. But the important thing about that is that it's not just Alan Moore being like, woo, magic. It's Gull stating, like, this is a misogynistic crime that we're about to commit, not just in the sense that we're going to do violence to women, but in the sense that we are a part of a society that perpetually oppresses women, and we're going to continue that oppression through this violence.
Yeah, and it's the weight of it is, I think, part of the oh, couldn't you cut this down, I think is part of the process of the book, like dragging you into it. Like, you cannot escape Gull telling you about this, just like Netley can't, just like the country can't escape the history. just like you, the reader, can't escape to the next sensationalistic bit.
So let's end this episode. We'll talk about some of the major themes that are in here. And I think the big ones are that Alan Moore claimed that he wanted to think about solving crimes in a holistic manner, the psychogeography aspect, which we'll revisit. And then we haven't really even talked about this. There's a whole Alan Moore fourth dimensional time is a flat circle thing going on in here as well.
That is true. I will say that the bits at the end that sort of embody what you just described, do feel like the fiction of the story. Like it's almost
like when his like spirit is visiting all of
It's like the lightness of the fictional narrative being declared because you've been so deep in the seemingly documentary style presentation of poverty and violence. And so it's almost like it gives the reader some relief.
Yeah, I think so. But I also think, like, as a theme, it connects. Well, we'll get into it. It connects Jack the Ripper to the present day that it was being written in, but also I think it distinguishes it from all the other Ripperology nonsense. In that, like, I don't think anybody, even Stephen Knight, imagined that William Gull was having hallucinations of the future while he was killing women.
Right. Or that his ghost would then continue to pass by windows in the future.
Oh, by the way, fun fact that I picked up this time on reading the book. Did you catch this in The Dance of the Gull Catchers? Stephen Knight went on to become a Rajneeshi.
No, I didn't catch that.
Yeah. So after he wrote this book, he joined the Rajneesh cult that is now famous because of the Wild Wild Country documentary. And then he passed away afterwards.
So it feels like I should make some kind of connection to the holistic detective agency stuff that came up in the research to that, where you have to, solve everything to solve any one thing. But I will now just use this blunt segue to get into this. Tim Callahan says that Alan Moore cites Douglas Adams's novel Dirk Gently's Holistic Detective Agency, which I guess is now also a television
TV show. Yeah, I haven't seen it, but yeah.
He said that novel, especially the holistic detective part of it, gave him like his way into the story. A holistic detective, says Moore, you wouldn't just have to solve the crime, you'd need to solve the entire world that the crime happened in. That was the twist I needed. So this is also part of that like huge long psychogeography chapter, is that solving the world that a murder occurred in. Because you can't just say, oh, this woman was killed because she went the wrong way down the road. Why'd you go that way down the road? Why was a person waiting for her? Why was, how did this culture get us to the point where there were people who were poverty-stricken serving folks who had far too much, et cetera, et cetera?
Yeah, I think that this describes better than I have what I've been looking for out of my true crime. I don't want to just read the sensational. I don't want the Dateline version of things. I want to get a reflection on how these crimes reflect the world in which they occurred in.
Right.
And I think the really good stuff does that. From Hell, we talked about Truman Capote and In Cold Blood. I think the first season of True Detective does that.
Yeah, but I mean, the first season of True Detective doesn't even quite reach the heights of From Hell. I mean,
no, it doesn't. Really... And I think you could find yet another comparison here to Pizzolatto, clearly using Alan Moore as a reference point.
Yeah, right down to actual stolen dialogue, right?
Yeah, and like his themes in True Detective are holistic detectives and time is a fourth dimension.
Greg Carpenter says of From Hell, the work, what began as an exploration of murder has become a commentary on the whole British Empire. Like a great prose novel, From Hell deliberately interrogates every strata of society: prostitutes, shopgirls, doctors, performers, artists, nobles, and even the queen. From Hell, in keeping with its title, emerges from the pit but aims heavenward, a comic book Tower of Babel, piling on level after level of ideas with the kind of ambition that makes the former superhero work of its own King Nimrod seem written in a different language.
That's an interesting turn of
Pretty
phrase.
Intense, yeah.
Yeah. There is an academic article that we consulted for this episode that is by someone named Elizabeth Ho, and it is called Postimperial Landscapes, Psychogeography and Englishness in Alan Moore's graphic novel From Hell, a Melodrama in 16 parts. It's a very well-written piece. I just wish that she would have included Eddie Campbell in the citation there. But Elizabeth Ho goes on to say that this book is an intervention in how Englishness is produced as an identity. And specifically because of their attention to the psychogeography stuff, that From Hell is attempting to remap what is now a touristy part of London as a place where there was a lot of trauma and suffering, and that these were all markers of the national consciousness actually changing over the century.
Yeah, and she connects it back to Sinclair's work too, saying that Ian Sinclair and Alan Moore, among others, are hoping to rescue the past or reclaim dead ground, and they will have to grapple with such pressure groups as developers, clerks, eco-freaks, and ward bosses who are hoping to curtail or erase the remaining traces of historical change. This is almost like hauntology, in its kind of working on what is changed by extreme and fast capitalism.
Yeah. I don't think it's a coincidence that Mark Fisher is also British, I feel like I'm going way off script here, but I feel like because they come from a society that is already post-imperial, that it's easier to have reflections like this about the world than it is in the context of America, which is, as we are recording this, an empire in descent.
Yeah. I mean, I was talking to someone about like what really marks the disarray of this moment in time.
Yeah.
And I think one of the big factors is we don't have a person to look at collectively to tell us the story of right now.
Mm-hmm.
And, that's, in a way, that's a luxury, but also that can be an essential piece of any group of people working together.
Yeah, what you're talking about in rhetorical criticism is referred to as constitutive rhetoric, where your leader, typically in American rhetoric, a president, but I would imagine in this situation, a prime minister or a queen, gives a speech that defines the identity of a people and helps them come together as a community, even though that identity might be imaginary.
Yeah, and sometimes that identity has to be understood in terms of goals and obstacles.
Yeah.
Right? Which I think becomes a lot more obvious to people in an industrialized world where it's not people existing in a natural world and each day is wake up, live, go to sleep. But instead is, well, how do we accomplish? How do we develop? How do we accomplish? How do we produce? How do we profit? Right?
Yeah. So the idea here from Elizabeth Ho's point of view is that this book not only reflects on what the context of society was like in England in the 1880s, but it does so through the lens of the 1980s and Thatcherism in redefining what the identity, what it means to be English. Yeah.
Here's the summation. That Ripperture, Ripper antics, I guess, or Ripper exploration.
I think it's Ripper literature.
Oh, okay. Got it. Ripperature and psychogeography coalesce around the East End. This is deliberate. The area has received the most attention from Margaret Thatcher's efforts at regeneration through investment capitalism and contains many diverse political elements and identities that can be considered as anti-Thatcher.
Yeah. So like, as I said, like when I remember going on that tour, I was like, wow, this is like pretty nice. It looks like people have fancy condos here. Like it wasn't what I expected. And I think even in that Kyle Kinane bit, which he did like maybe 2 or 3 years ago, he's like, yeah, you're just walking around and there's a KFC. And I said something like, yeah, I could butcher a bucket of KFC right about now or something like that.
So this, it makes perfect sense that From Hell has overlapping times as part of the narrative down to not down to, but including the extreme of the consciousness of one of its, limited narrators seeing the future.
Mm-hmm. Right. Which brings us to the nature of time as a theme in this, which I feel like Moore is one of the people who really like took off with this stuff in the 80s, and it's now reverberating into our pop culture nowadays. Like we just mentioned Pizzolatto, but I don't want to spoil too much, but I'm watching that show Devs on FX.
Yeah.
and Devs, the episode I watched just last night was like, let's do an episode that's all about the 4 dimensions of time, and we'll talk about like the physics of which I'm sure our listener Carmela Padovich is going to hate me talking about this, but like I don't understand like superimpositions and all that kind of stuff. But they go well into that. It feels like any piece of dense genre literature or storytelling nowadays feels like it's obliged to like put its baby toe into the 4-dimensional stuff.
Yeah, I hear what you're saying. I don't know if I think that the people that I read in high school, like some of the fantasy and science fiction, were so already digging into it.
Yeah.
That maybe it felt like it was always present. But I will totally go with, it seems like pop culture is embracing that idea of, time is happening all at once. The Kurt Vonnegut sort of idea of that alien race seeing everything at once despite it happening to us.
Or Philip K. Dick, the Empire was always there. That kind of stuff. Yeah. I think Moore was part of the generation that picked up on it from folks like Vonnegut, Philip K. Dick, Michael Moorcock. Yeah. And then they popularized it in our generation's mind. And now our generation, like you said, are the ones who are controlling mass media. And so all of a sudden it's showing up everywhere.
Now we're responding to things. Yeah. And a lot of people that we've already talked about or already referred to speak of how time is presented in From Hell and how Alan Moore must have been concerned both with the idea of time and also with the idea of his time at the moment. Tim Callahan says that From Hell includes echoes of the past, future, and present all colliding as if it were a jumbled timeline, despite being a very strict linear telling of the conspiracy story.
Yeah.
Greg Carpenter points out that the first lines are bloody shambles this last 6 years, a shambles inflicted from without, which in the story is about Europe and the Russian Revolution and the end of World War I, but could very well be about Moore's dealings with DC Comics,
right,
post Watchmen.
Yeah.
And then here's another. I believe this is an academic article, isn't it? Askari Rantala writes, complex repetitive patterns of Watchmen and From Hell simulate simultaneity and the detachment of time and space, which can be explored through the concept of the 4th dimension.
Let me see if I can unpack that.
God,
I think what they're trying to talk about is comics being a medium that is uniquely suited to talk about the idea of time as a 4th dimension, because of the pace and nature of which you read and are also visually exposed to comics, and the nature in which Moore and Gibbons and Watchmen and Moore and Eddie Campbell here in From Hell use the 9-panel grid and are bouncing back and forth between moment-to-moment transitions that are in one place at one time, moving slowly, and then the next panel will snap to like 100 years in the future.
Right.
And then snaps right back to the context that you're in.
Now, we could go into incredible detail on this. And so I think I want to pull out of that and just say this appears to all connect to Alan Moore's kind of overall statement of comics, which is comics can be a medium and should be a medium that tells stories in a way that only comics can, right? Mm-hmm. Sort of his essential rejection of movies being made of his stuff is that you can do a kind of repetition and a kind of visual patterning in comics that you can't do in anything else.
Yeah.
And that's what you should try to do in your work.
Yeah, I mean, that might be a little bit of a simplification. And I longtime listeners of the show will know what Charlie just said was actually one of the first things to get him in hot water on Reddit, I believe, 4 years ago when we first started this show. So, you know, take what you will from that. But yes, I tend to agree with you. I don't think that Alan Moore has like a overall sweeping generalization of why comics shouldn't be movies. But that is part of why he writes the way he does for comics. Mm-hmm. Elizabeth Ho picks up again by talking about how in the story, Gull's work itself is not just like apocalyptic and not just about the gendered nature of the city of London, but that it's also about, and this is again something like you and I would never be able to understand, Thatcherite enterprise culture, and that part of London serves to mirror Thatcher's economic restructuring of the welfare state and created an age of popular capitalism and a decade of growing inequality, right? Like, all I know is my experience of walking around and seeing fast food restaurants in that neighborhood. I don't think I could capture this. And Moore, I don't think anywhere in the text or even in the appendices mentions Thatcher by name.
No, and this is the work done in a place about the whole place as opposed to just the single sensationalistic tourism generator. There's almost a trust of people's ability to get what's being said, even if they don't know the details, mm-hmm. right? Because you've put enough care into how you deliver it. So your knowledge of the place, Alan Moore's knowledge of the place, informs a narrative that is still powerful to someone like me, even if I don't know what was actually happening.
So Ho goes on, like her big argument is essentially that what's fascinating about From Hell is that it forces any, like, what I just referred to as constitutive rhetoric, any of those attempts to define what English identity is, it forces it to confront with its actual past. And she looks at both Thatcher as an example and then fast forwards and looks at labor and the rhetoric of Tony Blair and says, like, you can see how both of those, even though they're politically polar opposites, were attempting to define British identity in a certain way. And From Hell kind of forces you back into recognizing like the inequality, both from a class level and a gender level, that's inherent in that culture.
And to not allow empire to drop from the understanding, even if mm-hmm. they were post-empire, even if they were, I don't think post-royalty is the way to say it, but like even if the way that royalty was understood was now very different, and the way that empire was understood, still there was this kind of re-engagement or necessary re-engagement with that history.
Yeah, it's an interesting piece. It's quite long, but we'll have a citation to it in the show notes. I think it's up on JSTOR, so you can probably read it on JSTOR. I had to have Charlie use his library skills to get us a copy that we could actually document here.
You mean my library's budget to buy access?
Yes, that's exactly it. Because I wasn't willing to spend $15 on a PDF file of this article.
And you shouldn't have, because someone had already spent that for me, and we're a team, Chris.
There we go. Which leads us to the last theme of this, which I think the fourth dimensional thing leads into quite well, which is Moore's theory is that this story acts as, and I don't mean this story as much as the story of trying to figure out Jack the Ripper, is something that allows you to summarize the Victorian era, but also acts as a birth to the 20th century.
Yeah, and we talked a little bit about this before. It's like the Jack the Ripper story, to make it something more than Jack the Ripper.
Yeah.
He had to go past the moment in time and the exploitative nature of it, and then start talking about what was happening around those Ripper murders.
Yeah.
And by the time he had gotten through with that expansion, he had found the entirety of the shift in global consciousness available to him.
Right. Glenn Miller describes the book as being a study of not just evil, but also violence, sexism, social and economic politics, and magic. Lots and lots of magic.
Right. He points out Hitler's birth is in there. There's a scene that is explicitly, Hitler's conception.
Crowley's in there too.
What's that?
Aleister Crowley.
Oh, yeah. And then two people who are mentioned that I have no idea who they are, Ian Brady and Myra Hindley.
I'm not familiar with them either.
So this is kind of a Moby Dick thing, right? The entirety of a particular moment in time, all of the knowledge of the cultural and technical underpinnings of society pressed into a extraordinary adventure narrative.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah.
And so From Hell is kind of an attempt at that. Although Alan Moore was not trying to stuff everything that he knew about his moment in time. He was trying to parse everything he could learn about a different moment in time.
Yeah, I think that's what's important here. This is a story that is so well researched that it shows you how we haven't actually come all that far. That, like, the resonances, I don't think are all purposeful on Moore's part. And that the class discrepancies or the gender discrepancies or all of these things that these various writers are unpacking here, it's the Cleo dynamics of it. That, like, we're going through periods of crises and turmoil and then peace over and over again in these cycles. And this was a moment of crisis in the identity of the people who had like a psychological relationships with the city they lived in. And it reverberated for a century and longer.
And there's a scene that, despite all of the thorough annotations of everything that happens in the book, there's one scene that Moore is cagey about, almost ironically, obscure about. He says, the reader will have to figure this one out by themselves. And it's a scene that sort of posits a escape from Gull.
Yeah. A
psychological and magical escape from Gull. And a woman sort of cries back to the past, this is not for you. Get back to where you came from. And this like incredibly hopeful, scarily hopeful moment is one of the things that Moore sort of declares, this is not researched. I didn't find something to prove this. This is something that the reader must take on themselves.
Yeah, it is. It is clearly the most fictional aspect. If I remember the movie correctly, again, it's been 19 years, but I think that is one of the few things that the movie actually adheres to.
It's a beautiful visual moment, and it's a very striking narrative moment. But the thing, the thing that really strikes me about that is that hope and transformation is what Alan Moore singles out by removing explanation from it in his annotations.
Mm-hmm. Well, in that way, I mean, we could go real deep into this, right? But like, I believe Alan Moore's notion of magic isn't Eldritch Blasts and Doctor Strange levitation cape. I believe that what he means is magic is how you use language and storytelling to change the world. And in that instance, something that is a cult that's occurring in the fictional story that he's created, he's seeing as like just a glimpse of hope that he's trying to inject into the world in light of these brutal murders and all this class discrepancy, both in that time and his own time. So yeah, I mean, we're kind of being cagey about this. I don't know. When you read this story, did it seem like it was that obscured? Like it didn't make any sense? Because I felt like it was pretty. There's a lot of hand-holding telling you like what had happened along the way.
I read it twice and then I felt like I got it. But there's also, there was some stuff that I got that there was a full annotation of, right? A description.
That's right. Yeah.
And there was some stuff that was easy to be explained that also he provided, here's the support of it. But it's like the moment when he breaks free of the research, the moment that he breaks free of historical fact or historically influenced fiction, right, is this hopeful moment in which a woman beats a man at his own game, right?
Yeah.
And so
let's just come out and say it. So
okay, go for it.
So the last murder is Marie Kelly, and Moore posits that it wasn't actually Marie Kelly that was killed because she had a lot of friends who were coming back and forth and staying with her in this flat that she rented, and that the murderer killed somebody who wasn't Marie Kelly. And not only did she escape him, but she escaped the clutches of prostitution in London, moved to Ireland, went on to become a mother of 4, whom she named all of her children after the victims.
Yeah.
And then when Gull dies, his ghost visits them. And she... Among
all the other things that he visits, all the other future that he sees.
And she essentially exorcises his ghost and banishes him from that hopeful place.
Yeah. And sends him back to his body so that he can die.
Where he dies miserably while 2 people are fucking like inches from his head.
I tell you, Chris, sometimes you can end a podcast like nobody's business.
It was quite a turn of phrase, but yeah, that's the fictionalized ending to From Hell. The least accurate, the least researched of any of it. And in the film, by the way, both in the film and in the book, it's culminated in that like there's a kind of romance that goes on between the inspector and the Mary Kelly character, but the inspector and Mary Kelly don't know that one another have those roles because they're both using like pseudonyms.
I don't think I'll ever see this movie.
You've been listening to Super Context, a podcast autopsy of media.
How it's made and how it informs our everyday culture.
Our theme music is Human Factor by Mile Marker.
And right now you're listening to Drive Fast by 3 Chainlinks.
Show notes and all our past episodes are available at supercontextpodcast.libsyn.com.
You can email the show at supercontextpodcast@gmail.com to tell us what you like, what you don't like, and to suggest topics for future shows.
And I'm available on Twitter as @Christian Sager.
And I'm there @Bennett Radio. 2 N's, 2 T's.